The Midnight Visitor. In the secluded town of Willowbrook, Halloween had always held a strange magic. The streets would fill with children in eerie costumes, their laughter echoing down every narrow lane. But this year a heavy sense of dread seemed to linger in the air, as though the shadows had come alive, whispering warnings of an old tale that everyone had nearly forgotten. Among the excited trick-or-treaters was 12-year-old Emma, whose love for Halloween had made her infamous in her neighborhood. She crafted her costume meticulously, transforming herself into a haunting yet elegant vampire, complete with pale makeup, fangs, and a flowing black cloak. However, as she prepared to leave the house, her grandmother pulled her aside with an unusually grave expression. "Emma," her grandmother whispered, gripping her hand tightly. "Years ago, people here told stories of the Midnight Visitor, a figure who would appear on Halloween night, just before midnight. He'd come dressed in a dark cloak with a wide-brimmed hat, and he'd knock on doors, but he never came for treats." Emma's face paled as her grandmother continued, her voice trembling. "They say he came for souls, especially those who wandered too far from home. Remember, if you see a stranger tonight, don't look at him. Don't listen. Just come home." Emma chuckled nervously, brushing off the story as one of her grandmother's spooky tales. She was almost sure it was just a way to scare her into coming back early. But as she and her friends walked into the foggy streets, that lingering feeling of unease stayed with her, like a shadow creeping along behind her. Halloween was in full swing. Houses were adorned with carved pumpkins, their grinning faces flickering ominously in the dim light, and decorations stretched across porches, ranging from cobwebs to ghostly apparitions that flapped in the breeze. Emma and her friends laughed and collected candy from every house, running from door to door and barely pausing to breathe. It wasn't until they reached the edge of town, near the old cemetery, that Emma felt a strange chill. She stopped, glancing back toward the dimly lit streets, where she thought she'd seen a figure standing under a street lamp. At first she thought it might be another trick-or-treater, but the figure didn't move. He wore a long black cloak, much like her own, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. "Emma, come on," her friend called, tugging her hand. But as they walked further, Emma kept glancing back. Each time the figure seemed closer, like he was silently gliding along the path they'd taken. The others didn't seem to notice him at all. She tried to laugh it off, thinking it was her imagination. Yet the chill in her spine wouldn't go away. As the night wore on, her friends decided it was time to head home. They parted ways, waving goodbye and laughing about their night. But when Emma looked down the street, the Midnight Visitor was there, still watching her. She quickened her pace, her candy bag swinging at her side as she tried to ignore the prickling feeling of being watched. But soon the quiet footsteps behind her became unmistakable. Each time she turned, he was closer. She could hear the soft rustling of his cloak and a low, almost musical hum coming from him like a lullaby. Desperately, she picked up her pace, telling herself it was just her imagination. She was almost home after all, and there was nothing to fear. Right. But just as she turned the last corner, she found herself facing him directly. The Midnight Visitor stood there, his figure looming in the fog. He lifted his head, and she caught a glimpse of his face, pale as moonlight, with piercing, unblinking eyes that held an unearthly glow. His lips curled into a slow smile, and he tilted his head. "I've been watching you, Emma," he said softly, his voice like the wind, chilling yet strangely hypnotic. Emma froze, her heart pounding. She tried to speak, but no words came out. "Do you know the rules?" he asked, his voice both gentle and threatening. "Each year I come for those who wander too far. But for you, Emma, I'll offer a chance. If you reach your door before the clock strikes midnight, you're free. But if not..." His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. Before she could react, he handed her an old, tarnished pocket watch, its hands frozen at 11:59. She took it instinctively, feeling its cold weight in her palm. With a last look, the midnight visitor whispered, "Run." Emma didn't hesitate. She spun on her heel and sprinted toward home, her pulse racing as she clutched the pocket watch. The world around her seemed to blur, shadows stretching and twisting as she ran. Every corner she turned, every street she crossed, the midnight visitor's footsteps grew louder, his laughter echoing in her ears. The pocket watch ticked, and the hands inched closer to midnight. She stumbled, nearly falling as she reached her street, her breath coming in gasps. Her house was just a few yards away, the porch light glowing like a beacon. But as she neared, she felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, and she turned to see the midnight visitor just a step behind, his eyes glowing with a terrible hunger. With a final burst of energy, Emma flung herself onto the porch, yanking the door open and slamming it shut behind her just as the watch struck midnight. She collapsed against the door, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. Outside all was silent. She dared to look out the window, but the midnight visitor was gone, vanished as though he had never been there. The only trace of his presence was the pocket watch still in her hand, its face forever frozen at 11:59. Emma placed the watch on the mantel, and in the quiet of her room that night, she lay awake, haunted by the distant echo of his laughter. She knew that next Halloween and every Halloween after that, he would return, waiting in the shadows, looking for his next visitor. That night, Emma drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, haunted by flashes of the midnight visitor's pale, chilling eyes. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel his icy gaze, hear his low whisper as it echoed through her mind. When dawn finally broke, she was exhausted, the memory of his eerie smile still lingering like a shadow. The next morning, Emma glanced nervously at the pocket watch, which she had placed on her bedroom dresser the night before. Her heart skipped a beat. The watch's hands, which had stopped at 11:59, were moving again, inching forward one tick at a time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the second hand crawled closer to midnight. With trembling hands, Emma picked up the watch and held it to her ear. Silence. She breathed a sigh of relief, but just as she lowered it, a faint sound whispered through the air. It was distant, like a breath on the wind, but unmistakable. "Next Halloween," the voice echoed, soft yet chilling, a promise she could not escape. Emma placed the watch back on her dresser and backed away, her heart racing. She knew somehow that the midnight visitor would return. Each Halloween the watch would count down, inching closer to midnight, waiting for the day she might not be fast enough. From that moment, every Halloween held a new unspoken terror. The midnight visitor was not finished with her. He was only waiting, lurking in the shadows, biding his time until she was alone once more. And as Halloween came closer each year, she felt the familiar chill, heard the faintest whispers, and sensed the ghostly presence drawing nearer, promising their game was far from over. Emma never ventured too far from home on Halloween again, but deep down she knew that one day, she might not be able to outrun him.